In one of the final scenes in Shakespeare's Macbeth, the titular character offers this response to his wife's death. Within his pessimism, he laments how life's actions are ultimately hollow and meaningless despite their grandeur. Beyond poking a bit of fun at how pretentiously Spectre opens with a bit of text, I chose this phrase to start the review because that last bit, a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing, is perhaps a stronger description than I would use, but nevertheless is fairly accurate in representing how I feel about this film. Spectre frustrates the living daylights out of me because I think it fails at almost everything it's trying to do. Normally, I can turn my brain off and just enjoy the spectacle of a Bond film. But when it is part of Daniel Craig's story-heavy tenure and features the long-awaited return of Spectre, I can't ignore its larger ambitions. I will, of course, have more than a few nice things to say about the film towards the end. No Bond film is without merit has been my mantra for these reviews, and I stand by that. However, there will be a few entries where I will come across very negative despite my best efforts, and I feel obliged to warn you up front that this will likely be one of those. The legal troubles that surround the character of Ernst Stavro Blofeld and his villainous organization have long been a standing issue with the series, and I've touched upon them several times already in past reviews. As is tradition, I'll pick up from where we last left off. After Never Say Never Again's release in 1983, Kevin McClory still felt like he had unfinished business, despite succeeding in producing his own version of Thunderball. Throughout the 80s and into the 2000s, Kevin pursued a few different avenues, such as a failed animated series in 1988, recycling his Warhead script from the 70s with a potential leading man in Pierce Brosnan set in Australia, and producing a live-action TV show in 1992. After the failed attempt with Sony that would have featured either Timothy Dalton or Liam Neeson as Bond in the late 90s, there was no major traction seen from McClory until he died in 2006, around the time of Casino Royale's release. In 2013, McClory's heirs sold these rights to Eon, finally allowing the makers of the official James Bond films to have these characters and elements back under their roof. So it was no surprise that the very next film would be partly sold on their return, since it would mark the end to the decades-long war. With the massive success of Skyfall, the future was positively bright for James Bond. The franchise was at an all-time high, both critically and commercially, so it was only natural that Eon wanted to secure as much of the creative team as possible that had done such a good job. Sam Mendes was reluctant to come back, as not only was his schedule pretty busy for the coming year, but he felt as though he had exhausted all his good ideas on Skyfall. The producers had learned their lessons several times about rushing into another film prematurely, so they agreed to wait and do a couple of other projects in the meantime, including releasing Eon's first non-Bond film since 1963. Whether intentional or not, enough time had passed that Mendes became available again. Despite several other directors' names being tossed around, I think the producers had their hearts set on Sam with writer John Logan. The duo worked together on a number of ideas, all featuring the return of Blofeld and Spectre. There were quite a few experiments, such as featuring Bill Tanner as a traitor at MI6, switching the gender of Blofeld, making M the villain, and even exploring the idea of shooting 2 Bond films at once, though it sounds like Craig was the one that put the kibosh on that. Despite Logan's work, Neil Purvis and Robert Wade were brought in yet again to work on the script, as it was reported that the core group wasn't happy, and Jez Butterworth, thanks to his previous uncredited contributions to Skyfall, was brought on as a 4th writer. With another fantastic cast coming together, including some terrific names like Christoph Waltz playing the villain Oberhauser, and Monica Bellucci finally getting to play a Bond girl after missing out in 1997, the 24th Bond film was announced in December 2014 as Spectre, and seemed like it was going to be another monumental outing for the super spy. Having received a video message from the deceased M, James Bond goes off on his own to hunt down a man called Marco Sciarra in Mexico City. The ensuing confrontation causes severe property damage, prompting the current M to officially ground Bond on his return to London. The Secret Service is undergoing a merger and is being brought together with a number of other global secret services under the watchful eye of Max Denby, who is pushing to scrap the 00 section. Determined to follow up on a lead from Sciarra, Bond heads to Rome to attend his funeral, where he rediscovers someone who he long thought dead at the head of an organization called Spectre, of which many of Bond's past villains were a part of. He hears them talking about an enemy of theirs, the Pale King, who is revealed to be Mr. White. Upon their reunion, Mr. White reveals to Bond that he is willing to give him information on Spectre in exchange for vowing to protect his daughter. Except, Meline Swan has no interest in Bond's help or being dragged back into the life of espionage. With Mallory facing political pressure at home and Bond out in the field hunting down Spectre, is there a chance that this man from the past will finish his crusade against 007 and the forces of good? When I finished Spectre for the first time in theaters, I gave up on my hope that a traditional Bond film with Daniel Craig would be coming. It was clear to me that the series was not interested in returning to that style at the time, and that was disappointing. While I understand that Craig and each director wanted to get something unique out of the films so that they didn't lose interest in the project halfway through and consider it a chore, I look at Roger Moore and marvel that he didn't feel the need to do that for his 12 years. And despite the inconsistency in quality in his films, he was almost always fun to watch, and each gave me something awesome that I looked forward to revisiting. Despite some intriguing elements, Spectre has several big strikes against it. On a pure petty and fanboyish level, it's not fun to watch for most of its bloated runtime. But more importantly, it sets up some goals for itself, and I feel like it fails at each of them. Now, fair warning, I'm going to spend a lot of time on this next part. The film wants to return to a more traditional style of Bond films, using the Connery era, Live and Let Die, and The Living Daylights as its guides. And with the addition of SPECTRE and Blofeld again, this should be easy, right? But here comes the first problem. SPECTRE both wants to be more traditional and have campier things like Blofeld and SPECTRE, and yet it's unwilling to move on from Craig's first 3 films' established tone. So right away, the movie squanders SPECTRE and Blofeld because it has to remove some of the more campy aspects to these concepts so that they can work within Craig's world. Instead of progressing the films to a point where a shadowy figure with a white cap might feel right at home with this version of Bond, the filmmakers generify them and rob them of all their color, which is a similar mistake that Never Say Never Again made with the group. If you're just going to do a more grounded Illuminati-esque group, what's the point in calling them Spectre beyond marketing the film? If I have to take away Superman's unyielding sense of optimism and prevent the audience from seeing him fly or be in a colorful suit in order to make him work in a more realistic world, it's starting to feel like I'm embarrassed about doing Superman in the first place. Same here. If the pressure of the fact that Austin Powers has poked fun at my most famous villain means I have to water him down so that he can work in a more straight Craig film, then I shouldn't do Blofeld at all. The second goal of the film is to tie all of the previous entries together and make it one larger story. It does this okay with Casino Royale and Quantum, but making Silva and Patrice part of the organization, as well as implying the death of Judi Dench's M was somehow part of Blofeld's revenge, feels too far. That film was so singular with its story, much like Goldfinger was during the Connery run, and I have an easier time buying Silva as a rogue agent and Patrice as a mercenary than that they too took orders from the same man. Spectre already has enough to tie it into Skyfall, Bond's past, Judi Dench's M reaching from beyond the grave, and the returning MI6 characters. Why do we need to force that film's villains and story into a retroactive development step towards this film? It feels like Spectre has an inflated sense of self-importance, and it's weird that it feels the need to do this because the fact that we have Spectre and Blofeld back in the official series should already be big enough. It comes off as a kid trying to make the playground story grander for the sake of the adventure. At some point, it becomes egotistical and leaves a bad taste. The third goal is to set up Bond's next great love in Meline Swan. Léa Seydoux is a fine actress, but boy, this character doesn't work for me. She and Craig don't have enough chemistry to make their scenes interesting to watch. I don't ever get the sense that they are into each other until the dinner scene on the train, and it's not too long afterwards that Bond and Swan will both be making claims of love to each other. There's an interesting idea that the daughter of a villain might be the only one to understand Bond and his work, but not only is it weird that it's Mr. White's daughter, but there is no exploration of this idea because Meline refuses to discuss it with Bond or accept that she can't escape being dragged back into this life. It leaves me so cold to the character that it feels unfair to put her in the same emotional area as Tracy and Vesper. If it weren't for No Time to Die's corrections, Swan would be my least favorite Bond woman of them all, and that's saying something. The fourth goal is to get Bond to consider a life beyond MI6. Right away, this is an idea that I resist because Skyfall just spent 2 hours reaffirming that Bond's place is in the service. What justifies the next film into going into this point now? We still have yet to see Craig doing more grunt work-like adventures on the big screen like we see in the video games Bloodstone and the GoldenEye remake, so it feels like we're just doing the big moments of the story rather than showing us the ride. It's like doing the story of Ray Charles without showing his drug addiction and personal woes. His triumph over those things and the success of his career only carries weight if it comes after spending time with him during those struggles. Those moments might seem less important in the grand scheme, but what people fail to understand is that they are the building blocks of the structure. Just showing the highlights and leaving out all the in-between stuff is cheating your audience. Remove the day-to-day stories in favor of just showing the big moments, and we lose the heart of the story. Same with Craig's Bond going to retirement in his 4th movie. You can't just say, well, you've had 20 more traditional adventures in the series, just insert them in between the films we're doing now. Because A, this is a new timeline that paves over the older adventures, and this film doubles down on that notion by introducing a new version of SPECTRE and Blofeld, so a good chunk of those movies can't be included here anyway. And B, reducing a character's journey to only the big moments is removing a lot of the meat from the meal. Can you imagine a Lord of the Rings adaptation where we spent no time developing the Fellowship characters and we just jumped ahead to Mount Doom and the big battles? What if we did a version of Hamlet where we spent no time with Hamlet discussing his feelings about Claudius and why he wants revenge, and we just skipped to the second half of the story? What if we just killed Superman in his 2nd movie without focusing on his smaller feats of heroism and getting us to be inspired by him first? Just because part of a series isn't directly tied into the progression of the ongoing story doesn't mean it isn't serving a deeper purpose. The 5th and final goal is to be a thrilling action piece. As you can guess by now, this film really struggles even handling that, in my opinion. Aside from the pre-credits, all of the other action scenes feel lackluster and tame. I don't mind more grounded visions for action, but there needs to be some payoff in each of the scenes on a thrill level for them to work. The Rome car chase is a good example. It's too restricted. There's no great stunts, the drivers hardly interact with each other, and there's no real progression to the action itself. It starts as a car chase without offensive gadgets, but it gets interrupted with Bond calling Moneypenny to get an info dump, which means most of the action in the chase is unimportant. After the call, the chase can finally do a couple of cool things, but by this point we've spent so much time with Hinks chasing Bond that it's too little too late. Compare this to any of the other great car chases in the series. Each of them focuses on the actual action happening in front of our eyes. They also have something that changes the situation, feature a great stunt, or have elements of danger and urgency throughout. This chase has little of that, so it's a big disappointment given how much we were looking forward to seeing the DB-10 in action. On a side note, I understand that part of this problem was exacerbated by Italian officials. They didn't want to see their beloved city destroyed, so they limited what the filmmakers could do. I can sympathize with that. But then you need to rewrite the scene. Either pull a Skyfall and have the chase move outside of the city, or end the chase quickly and have Bond and Hinks confront each other in some other way. Shoot out, punch up, game of cat and mouse, I don't know, something. I guess I just feel that Sam Mendes has real trouble when it comes to the action in his films. I don't think I've ever seen as big of a drop in quality between a director's first and second Bond film. Some went up in quality, like Terrence Young went from Dr. No to From Russia with Love, or Lewis Gilbert from You Only Live Twice to The Spy Who Loved Me. Some did experience a downgrade, like Guy Hamilton from Goldfinger to Diamonds, and arguably John Glenn from For Your Eyes Only to Octopussy. But here the downgrade is rather marked because I'm scratching my head more. How can the same man who made Skyfall, a film that proved for me that it had a great respect for both the literary and cinematic 007, as well as pulling off a thoughtful story, suddenly make a follow-up that has little understanding about the series' past and a story that commits some grave errors? Maybe Mendes should have listened to his first instincts and stayed away from this one if he had to generate interest for himself to return. The foundations of the story makes for a flawed construction project in my eyes. Bond being the ringleader of MI6, a group that actually has less experience than he does in the field, is not interesting to me, mostly because it makes Bond feel more like Ethan Hunt than anything. M having to battle bureaucracy at home justifying the existence of the 00 program is an idea that worked before in the last film. But here, it feels like spinning wheels in order to make the movie seem more important and relevant on a thematic level. Bond finding love again is fine, but I've already addressed why that doesn't work here. However, the biggest piece of criticism I've seen levied against the film is with Blofeld. Christoph Waltz is a wonderful actor, exactly the kind I would have gotten for the part, but tying him into Bond's past was a terrible move. It feels too comic booky. Blofeld would be most everyone's pick for Bond's archenemy, but not because they're essentially brothers. It's because it's a battle that we've seen fought across multiple films, and then the position of archenemy was cemented with Tracy's death. The adopted brothers angle feels like a contrived way to make this villain the most central to Bond's life, despite others striking deeper wounds in previous Craig films. But what's worse is how Blofeld describes his motivations. He likens it to a cuckoo bird building its home in the nest of another, which was apparently an idea from Michael G. Wilson. The way it comes across is that this is an immature boyhood feud that lingered. Bond needed to be raised by some people after his parents' death, and because his own dad loved the other child more and spent more time with him over a few years than his actual son, Blofeld is going to dedicate his entire life not only to killing his dad for depriving him of love and attention, because, families with multiple children are guaranteed to raise supervillains for focusing on the more needy children in lieu of teaching the others how to ski, but destroying Bond as well, with the reformation and manipulation of governments being a bonus. This is not compelling material. It's inane and a lame justification for Blofeld's machinations. Somehow, the protagonist and antagonist having no shared background was way more interesting and exhilarating than making them family. But even beyond my issues with the goals of this film and the basic story skeleton, there's more than enough things to take issue with. This film feels like it takes all of its 2.5 hours to get through because virtually every scene is played with such low energy by the performers. Sometimes that works, like in the scene with Mr. White building a fine tension, but most of the time it feels drawn out because the audience isn't sharing in the tension or intrigue of the scene. The Spectre meeting room has several moments where nothing is happening, because we are waiting to see what Blofeld or someone else will say, more so to break the silence than to punctuate the drama. The scene with Blofeld and Bond at the former MI6 headquarters is devoid of resonance because neither actor feel like they have an emotion building underneath. The scenes with Andrew Scott C feel pointless because it's a foregone conclusion that he's a villain that will be thwarted and the 00 section will not be going away, regardless if Bond stays with MI6. In my view, this film is wasting time because it's assuming I'm more with it than I am, and that's a problem because it hasn't presented me with the right things to get on board with its story, themes, or actions. It's not even like I can enjoy the main actor's performances. Craig feels like he's sleepwalking through the film. Sado is too cold and reserved for me to want to bond with her character. Waltz has no dimension to his villainy and is no fun to watch, and all of the good side performers feel like they're passed over too quickly. Monica Bellucci is a terrific choice, but her character is discarded within 5 minutes. Jesper Christensen gives his best performance as Mr. White here, but once again, it's over too quickly. And Hinks doesn't get nearly enough time to pay off his potential. The cinematography is generally good, with Christopher Nolan veteran Hoyt van Hoytma returning to film stock here, though I really dislike the color correction. It's far too brown for my tastes. Bond finally getting back the DB5 is a great idea for the ending, but because I don't buy into the relationship, I'm not thrilled about Bond quitting the service to run off with Swan. Plus, they are still using the David Arnold version of the Bond theme as end credits music. Now it's coming off as scared laziness here, Newman. Just try a different arrangement or recording of the theme, for goodness sake. And I know you can, given that I adore some of your versions of the theme for this film, and despite your score's constant reuse of the material from Skyfall. A small nitpick I have is with the film's marketing. Though it was widely known that the film was going to feature the return of Spectre as an organization, a ruse was kept up that Waltz was going to play Oberhauser and there was no acknowledgement of Blofeld. This seems stupid to me. How is the reveal that Blofeld is in a film revolving around Spectre an actual reveal you want to keep from audiences? Those that know what those things are will have already figured it out long before they see the film, and those that don't won't care. I do have a question. When Bond meets Q at the clinic, he tells him to examine the Spectre ring. Through DNA analysis, Q confirms that Oberhauser is alive. Then he makes the claim that almost all of Bond's past villains are a part of the same group. I get some of them, but how does he know that Silva and Patrice are a part of Spectre? Did I miss something? Shall we spend some time with the parts of the film that I think really work? It has far more misses for me, but there are some genuinely good things here. The pre-title sequence is a strong opening. The continuous opening shot is terrific and filled with the right mixture of intrigue, danger, and cool. The moment when Bond hops onto the balcony and the atmospheric Bond theme plays is goosebumps-inducing. The fight in the helicopter isn't my favorite in the series, but it's a wonderfully well choreographed and paced action scene, with plenty of things in common with the best of the series. This is the sequence out of the entire Craig era that feels the most like classic Bond to me. And while I'm fine with the newer flavor of Craig's Bond for the most part, it got my hopes up that I was finally about to get my wish for a more traditional film. Sadly, that wasn't to be. I know I'm in the minority, but I really like Sam Smith's song, more so musically than because of his performance. True, it's a slower, more melancholy song than we've had in the series up to now, but I think it's quite powerful in parts and matches the moodiness of Craig's Bond this time out. I can't defend Smith's performance, though I think it matches the emotions of the song. I think the titles are actually an improvement over Skyfall's. I adore the menacing octopus and the use of the tentacles and a lot of the imagery, like the multiple eyes around Bond, the skeletal hands that appear in front of the Spectre agents, and Blofeld's head being a mixture of the skull and octopus. The one issue I have is with the reuse of images from past Bond films. I know why they're here, but I just don't care for the idea. This film continues the series' great streak of locations. Rome is a city I always felt Bond should have gone to at some point. And as a side note, I wrote a fan script for a Bond film once that had a good chunk of the action feature in Rome. Mexico City is a fine choice, complete with the Day of the Dead celebration. There's something very Thunderball and Moonraker about this whole sequence, taking a chance to highlight the culture as part of the larger atmosphere. It shares a couple of locations in common with the Living Daylights, Snowbound, Austria, and Tangiers. It then ends in London, which I guess is fine. The extra thing I like about the Tangiers Morocco setting is that Blofeld's lair is in an area called Gara Medwar. Beyond evoking the imagery of You Only Live Twice's lair, this is an area that was first used in the 1999 version of The Mummy. I take issue with the use of the MI6 characters in the story, though each of them does fantastic work. Mallory calling Bond on the carpet for his actions in Mexico City is fantastic. Moneypenny's scenes with Bond have some decent interplay, with the added awesomeness of seeing Bond's sparsely decorated residence. I can't tell you how giddy I was to see a proper Q branch scene here, and I think it's mostly excellent, with Q laughing at his own joke being really funny to me. Q getting out into the field is fun, though definitely forced. There's a shot with Donna Lucia that's so good, and it's the bit with her going out into the darkness with the assassins behind her. Plus, the following scene is one of my favorites from the film. Craig feels the most like classic Bond here, with several of the lines feeling like they could have come out of Connery's mouth. Even if I don't love the chase sequence, I love the cars in Rome. I adore the costuming in this film. Bond's white tux is excellent, as is Madeline's dress. Blofeld's suit has a very Dr. No vibe about it. This film, like Skyfall, has a lot of references to past Bond films and stories that are hard to miss. Two of my favorites are the elevator in Mexico City being the same one from License to Kill, and the safe house being the Hildebrand Prints and Rarities. In addition to being a nod to one of the best Fleming short stories, this place was established in 1953, the same year Casino Royale was published. Spectre is a strong candidate for my least favorite official Bond film. After a spectacular opening 15 minutes, I find it dreadfully dull for most of the runtime, facepalm-inducing towards the last half hour, and only punctuated with a few brief solid scenes. Generally, after a great pre-title sequence, you want a Bond film to slope upwards in excitement and momentum. This film goes the opposite way, tripping after the first half hour and spiraling down the mountain until it lands in the bushes. The good things that are in the film either make the experience worse because they give me hope, or are forgotten about so quickly it's like they never happened. Despite my harsh criticism of the film, it's nowhere near the worst movie I've ever seen, but within the excellent series it's a part of, it forms the bottom of the barrel. It is still a Bond film, but one with so little uniquely interesting or captivating on its own. I've said before that the biggest error a film within a series can make is when its high points are things that other entries have done better. Virtually everything in this film has been topped somewhere else in the series. There are better pre-title sequences, better Blofelds, better concentration of action scenes, better true love interests for Bond, better gadgetless sequences, better uses of the MI6 characters, and better Craig Bond performances. If this film wasn't a part of the Bond series, I doubt I would even be motivated to regularly rewatch it, much less own it. And I know I'm not alone in this viewpoint. Spectre is often placed towards the bottom of a lot of ranking lists, despite several films having a worse critical reputation. Bottom line, my first Bond film in the theaters after 7 years was a dud, and I sincerely hope that Craig wouldn't end his tenure with this one. It would take another 6 years before the next Bond film would be released in cinemas, though not entirely because of the lengthy production timeline. Despite the press making a fuss about an out-of-context interview claiming he had no interest in returning to the role, Daniel Craig signed on for a 5th film, making it crystal clear that it would be his last. Unlike the other official Bond actor finales, the filmmakers were determined to make Bond 25 with that as its focal point both in the story and marketing. This was an unprecedented move for Bond, and would lead to the longest and boldest film in the series' 60-year history.